Hey guys. Tonight, we begin with a world of beauty, power, and just a little bit of divine vengeance. It's ancient Greece, where the goddesses were radiant, immortal, and absolutely not to be messed with. Because if you cross them, you wouldn't just lose an argument. You might lose your mind, your family, or your life. The world is mythical, enchanting, and much darker than the marble statues suggest. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You've just stepped into the darker side of Olympus, where even goddesses held grudges. The streets of Athens at dusk smelled like roasted lamb, sweat, and a little bit of sewage. Though nobody dared to call it sewage. Because in ancient Greece, if the gods hadn't struck you down with a thunderbolt yet, clearly your hygiene was fine. The air was thick with chatter, sandals slapping on worn stone, and somewhere a lyre was plucking out a tune that sounded suspiciously like the same 3 notes on repeat. But you're not looking at the people bustling around with amphorae, or the market stalls crammed with olives. No, your eyes are fixed on the temple steps, where statues rise higher than a mortal man's courage. And if you're clever, you're not admiring the marble. You're wondering what kind of goddess demands offerings piled so high that the smell of rotting figs outcompetes the incense. It's an unsettling thought, isn't it? Because here, under the looming shadow of stone columns, lies a truth the poets never quite admitted in their flowery verses. Greek goddesses were terrifying. Beautiful, yes. Enchanting, absolutely. But as dangerous as standing between a Spartan and his breakfast. They were divine forces, sure, but they carried grudges the way modern people carry phones. Always ready, always in hand, and impossible to put down. Step out of line, make the wrong offering, or worse, catch their jealous gaze, and your name might end up in the kind of myth that school children whisper about centuries later. Take Hera for instance. Hera, the queen of the gods, patron of marriage. On the surface, she should be a warm protector of wedding vows and happy homes. But don't be fooled. Hera treated infidelity the way a modern teenager treats Wi-Fi outages with absolute, all-consuming rage. And Zeus, her thunderbolt-slinging husband, was essentially the worst partner in history. By modern standards, he makes reality TV contestants look loyal. Every time he sneaked off to turn into a swan, a bull, or, yes, once, disturbingly, a shower of golden light, Hera's fury simmered like a pot about to boil over. Except instead of muttering under her breath, or posting cryptic messages on Instagram stories, she tended to curse women into monsters, drive them into madness, or ruin their families for generations. You'd think the sensible thing would be to direct her divine rage at Zeus, the actual culprit. But no. Hera had the kind of selective anger your boss might have when you arrive 5 minutes late. The co-worker who tattled takes the hit, not the manager who made the rules. Mortals and mistresses bore the brunt of her vengeance. Poor Io, for example, one of Zeus's unfortunate lovers. Hera transformed her into a cow, a literal cow. Imagine living your life chewing cud, just because the king of the gods couldn't keep his toga on. And worse, Hera didn't just stop there. She sent a gadfly, buzzing endlessly around Io's bovine form, stinging her day and night. Eternal harassment in the form of an insect. That's Greek mythology's version of a spam caller, who never gives up. And yet, here's the trick. While ancient hymns praised Hera's majesty, ordinary Athenians never forgot the stories. You can almost hear the whispers in the market, mothers tugging their children closer. Be careful. Don't boast too loudly about your beauty. Hera listens, because nothing drew her wrath faster than the hint of mortal arrogance. And really, it's relatable. How often today do people scroll through their feeds and mutter, "Oh sure, another perfect vacation photo, Karen." Hera was basically the divine embodiment of that feeling. Except instead of muttering, she might strike down your entire bloodline. Now, if you're standing on those temple steps at twilight, you notice the shadows stretch longer, pooling like ink. The marble doesn't just gleam. It seems to watch. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. No one says aloud, It wasn't just Hera. All the goddesses carried a darkness with them, tucked between their stories of grace and wisdom, like a knife hidden in silk. Athena, who draped herself in the cloak of wisdom, was merciless to those who challenged her intellect. Aphrodite, goddess of love, could make passion bloom, but just as easily sow jealousy and destruction. Even Demeter, gentle mother of the harvest, held the power to starve entire cities with the twist of her divine will. The deeper you wander into their world, the more you realize these were not fairy tale figures. They were rulers of fear as much as they were patrons of beauty. And the people of Greece, the men and women walking barefoot over hot stone and praying with trembling hands, they knew it. Every sacrifice, every hymn, every whispered prayer wasn't about devotion. It was about survival. And between us, doesn't that sound familiar? Replace sacrifice a goat to Hera with sacrifice your sanity to your inbox, and you'll see people haven't changed that much. We still offer up little pieces of ourselves every day, hoping the force is bigger than us. Whether divine, corporate, or just the landlord, don't decide to ruin our lives. The night deepens over Athens, torches flickering against the temple walls. The smoke twists upward as if it, too, is trying to flee the weight of the goddess watching from above. Inside, the smell of incense mixes with something harsher, burnt fat from animal sacrifices still clinging to the stones. Priests chant in low tones, and every syllable carries like a warning. Hera is listening. She always listens. And mortals, they never really stood a chance. Take poor Semele, a mortal princess. Wide-eyed and probably convinced, she'd caught the attention of the universe's ultimate bachelor. Zeus descended to her with promises of love, whispering sweet nothings, as gods tend to do when they're not busy reshaping mountains. But Hera, clever as any courtroom lawyer, disguised herself as an old woman. She slipped into Semele's confidence, nudged her with poisonous words, and convinced her to ask Zeus for proof of his divinity. It was a trap worthy of the finest drama. Semele begged. Zeus swore on the river Styx, an unbreakable oath, and appeared before her in his full divine glory. Lightning, thunder, the works. Beautiful, terrifying, deadly. And Semele, she didn't survive the show. Hera didn't strike the blow herself, but her cunning made it possible. You might call it gaslighting, ancient edition, and she played the game better than anyone. Now, if this feels cruel, you're right. But cruelty was part of her divine portfolio. Imagine living in a world where your fate hinged on not catching the wrong goddess's eye. Drop your clay jug. Fine. Insult Athena. You might spend eternity weaving tapestries for spiders. Complain about marriage. Hera might personally drop by with a curse. The gods didn't have customer service hotlines. Their wrath was final, and the return policy was non-existent. And here's the bitter irony. While men prayed for victory in war, women prayed to Hera for safe childbirth, for the fragile hope of a marriage without tragedy. It's like begging your strictest teacher for mercy, even though you know she graded your paper with red ink before you even wrote your name. People didn't worship out of pure adoration. They worshipped out of fear, bargaining with the divine as if their lives were chips in a game they could never win. It almost makes you chuckle, doesn't it? Modern people complain when their Wi-Fi cuts out for 5 minutes, and yet here, centuries ago, entire families fasted, sacrificed, and begged Hera not to unleash misery. It's enough to make you wonder which is worse, the wrath of a goddess or the wrath of a teenager whose phone battery just died at 2%. Step closer to the temple doors, though, and you see something more chilling than statues and offerings. Stories themselves have weight. They cling to these stones. Whisper the name, Hera, and you feel the echo of every wronged lover, every cursed mortal. And you realize she wasn't unique. Hera may have been the queen, but every goddess had shadows stitched into her tapestry. Athena, the supposed paragon of wisdom, had no patience for hubris. The mortal girl Arachne learned that the hard way. She was just a talented weaver, bold enough to challenge the goddess herself in a contest. When Arachne's work outshone Athena's, the goddess didn't just sulk. She struck the girl down, transforming her into the first spider, cursed to weave for eternity. It wasn't justice. It wasn't wisdom. It was pettiness draped in divine armor. And here's where the whispers grow louder. You can almost hear them as the torches sputter. The goddesses weren't simply protectors. They were rivals of mortals, competitors in beauty, intellect, and love. They didn't tolerate being second best, and they certainly didn't tolerate being mocked. In fact, Greek myths often read like cautionary tales not to outshine your betters. The message was clear: stay humble, keep your head down, and never, ever assume you're safe from divine jealousy. It's the same feeling as sitting in a classroom when the teacher asks a question and you know the answer, but you hesitate. Because if you speak up too confidently, everyone will glare at you. The Greek goddesses were the ultimate embodiment of that social tension, except instead of glarers, you got transformed into livestock or cursed to wander deserts. Now, imagine standing at the heart of the temple, shadows draped across the marble floor. Every flicker of flame feels like it carries a story. Au's torment, Semele's destruction, Arachne's fall. The goddesses were as much warnings as they were objects of worship. And the mortals knew this. They prayed not because they believed themselves beloved, but because they knew themselves vulnerable. That's the darker truth hiding beneath the hymns and statues. Worship wasn't just reverence. It was survival. And if you think Hera's jealousy or Athena's wrath was unsettling, wait until you step into the realm of Aphrodite. For if beauty could destroy and love could rot into obsession, her shadow was darker still. The sea smelled different at dawn. Not just salt and spray, but something heavier, almost sweet, as if the waves themselves had been perfumed. Fishermen swore that when the goddess Aphrodite stirred, the waters carried a warmth no sun could explain. And if you happened to be awake on one of those mornings, standing barefoot on the damp sand, you'd feel it too. A shimmer in the air, the hush before beauty itself arrived. Her story, as every child in Greece learned before they could count olives, was scandalous even by divine standards. Born from the foam of the sea, or if you asked certain poets, from the severed remains of Uranus tossed into the waves, Aphrodite emerged radiant, terrible, and irresistible. It's a creation myth that sounds poetic until you realize the divine embodiment of love was born from mutilation. Beauty sprouted from blood. And that, in itself, tells you everything you need to know. Aphrodite was never harmless. She was the most dangerous kind of goddess, the one who could smile while dismantling your life. The Greeks didn't just worship her. They feared her. Because love, as they knew too well, was not gentle. It was consuming. It burned hotter than fire and drowned deeper than the sea. And Aphrodite, with her sly smile and eyes that could unravel kingdoms, decided who suffered that fate. You can almost hear the nervous laughter of men and women praying at her shrines. Please, goddess, let me love. But not too much. Please, goddess, let them love me. But not the wrong way. It's the kind of bargaining you might recognize in the modern world, every time someone texts their crush, and then stares at the screen, praying for those 3 dots to appear. Consider Helen of Troy. Beautiful, yes, but it wasn't her fault. Her face launched 1,000 ships. That was Aphrodite's doing. She promised Paris, the mortal prince of Troy, the love of the most beautiful woman alive, and she delivered, except Helen was already married. What followed wasn't romance, it was bloodshed. 10 years of war. Thousands dead, cities burned, all because a goddess turned desire into a weapon. People like to talk about the Trojan horse, the battles, Achilles sulking in his tent. But beneath all of it was Aphrodite's hand, unseen but everywhere, twisting love into destruction. And she didn't stop there. Take Phaedra, cursed with an overwhelming passion for her stepson. Or Persephone, driven by divine madness to lust after a bull. Yes, that bull, the one that produced the Minotaur. Aphrodite's touch was not a gentle blessing. It was a shove off a cliff, the kind that left mortals gasping in shame and ruin. Love in her grasp was less romantic comedy, and more Greek tragedy. Still, mortals kept building temples, laying garlands of roses, pouring out wine in her name. Because who could risk angering the goddess of love? To ignore her was to risk loneliness, the cruelest punishment of all. Better to bow before her, even if you knew her gifts were poisoned. It's not unlike modern dating apps. People know disaster often lurks one swipe away. But they keep swiping anyway, because the alternative is silence. And here's the most chilling part. Aphrodite wasn't always acting out of spite. Sometimes she simply didn't care. To her, love was a game, a force of nature. She set it loose the way a child might release a bird from a cage. not thinking about the destruction that fluttered in its wake. For the mortals caught in her storms, though, the consequences were permanent. Broken families, wars, shame carved into the bones of myth. Beauty was supposed to uplift, and yet in her hands, it bound chains tighter than iron. Imagine walking through one of her temples now, the marble cool under your feet, roses scattered across the altar. You can almost smell them, heavy and sweet. Though beneath that sweetness is the rot of old offerings, honey long spoiled, perfumes turned sour. Worshippers bow their heads, but their prayers tremble. Because everyone knew Aphrodite could give you everything you thought you wanted, only to make you regret you ever asked. And if Hera's jealousy seemed cruel, Aphrodite's indifference was worse. To be cursed by Hera was at least personal. Her rage had your name on it. Aphrodite, though, could ruin you without even glancing your way. Your heart could betray you, your desires twist against you, and you'd never even know she was near. That's the kind of power mortals feared most, not the strike of a lightning bolt, but the quiet unraveling of their own will. So, as you leave the temple, the night air clinging to your skin, you realize something unsettling. Beauty and love weren't gifts in ancient Greece. They were tests. And Aphrodite was the examiner who never played fair. And if you think her games were cruel, just wait until you glimpse Athena's perfection. For what is worse, to be destroyed by desire, or humiliated by wisdom that never falters? The temple grows quieter as the night stretches, but Aphrodite's presence lingers like perfume that refuses to fade. Her worshippers trickle away, sandals clapping against the stone, their prayers whispered in the dark. Yet her stories remain heavy in the air, thick as incense smoke. To know Aphrodite is to know that beauty and desire are never safe, never stable, and never truly yours. Take Adonis, for example, the mortal so breathtakingly handsome that even Aphrodite herself could not resist him. She wrapped him in her favor, adored him, cherished him. But love, in the Greek world, was never without shadow. Adonis was destined to die young, torn apart by a wild boar's tusks. Some whispered it was the jealousy of Ares, Aphrodite's lover and the god of war, who arranged the hunt to rid himself of a rival. Others claimed it was fate, unchangeable and cruel. But what mattered was the image, the goddess of love kneeling in grief, blood staining her hands, unable to save the man she adored. It was a rare moment when even Aphrodite tasted the bitterness she so often served to others. Mortals told the story as both tragedy and warning. Beauty draws not only adoration but also envy, and envy is always hungry. Even when the goddess herself loves you, death waits at the edge of the woods. It's almost comforting to realize Aphrodite couldn't bend the world entirely to her will. Almost. And then there were her rivalries. You would think goddesses, each divine in their own right, might respect one another. But in truth, they were as petty as any group chat, filled with competing egos. The judgment of Paris is proof enough. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite quarreled over who was the fairest. They placed the decision in the hands of a mortal shepherd, Paris of Troy. Each goddess tried to bribe him. Hera with power, Athena with wisdom, Aphrodite with love. And of course, Paris chose Aphrodite's gift, the love of Helen. The war that followed, the bodies that piled on the beaches of Troy, were not born of strategy or politics alone. They were born of a beauty contest. If you've ever seen friends fall out over who looked best in a group photo, you already understand the core of it. Except here, the stakes were empires. And yet worship continued. Offerings of roses, honey, and doves filled her sanctuaries. Not because mortals adored her unconditionally, but because they dared not risk neglect. A fisherman's wife prayed for her husband to return safely. A young girl whispered for a kind husband instead of a cruel one. Lovers pressed coins into her altars, desperate for affection to last more than a fleeting season. It wasn't love they prayed for, it was survival through love's storms. The irony was sharp. Aphrodite, goddess of love, rarely offered stability. She brought longing, obsession, lust, jealousy, every wild emotion that tore people apart. Her temples were filled with hopeful faces, yet every prayer was edged with fear. To ask for her blessing was like inviting fire into your home, trusting it to keep you warm, while knowing it could just as easily burn the house down. And if you could stand among them, listening to their whispered pleas, you'd feel that same mix of awe and dread. The goddess was beautiful, yes, but beauty was never free. It demanded sacrifice. It demanded risk. It demanded everything. Modern life isn't so different, is it? People still chase beauty, still risk everything for love, still worship at altars made of glowing screens instead of marble. And just like in Athens, the offerings pile up, hours lost to endless scrolling, fortunes spent on appearances, sleepless nights haunted by desire. Aphrodite may not walk the earth anymore, but her shadow lingers every time someone sighs over a photo and thinks, if only. As the temple doors close and the torches die out, her presence clings like a promise. You walk away, heart heavy, realizing that in Greece, beauty was never a gift. It was a gamble, and most mortals lost. But if love could consume you so completely, what of wisdom? What of perfection sharpened into a weapon? If you think passion's fire is unbearable, wait until you feel the cold edge of Athena's judgment. The Parthenon did not sleep. Even in the silence of midnight, its marble columns seemed awake, gleaming like bones under the moonlight. The city around it hushed, but Athens always hummed with something, perhaps pride, perhaps fear, for this was Athena's city, and everyone knew it. Her name sat heavy in the air, stitched into every stone. And if Hera's temples smelled of incense and jealousy, and Aphrodite's of roses and longing, Athena's reeked of oil and iron, wisdom sharpened into spears. Athenians adored their patron goddess, or at least they said they did. You could hardly avoid it, living here. The olive tree she gifted the city stood as a reminder. Athena had defeated Poseidon himself for the honor of naming Athens. He gave them a spring of salt water. Impressive, sure, if you were fond of brine and drowning. Athena offered the olive fruit, oil, wood, shade, a gift for war, peace, and dinner alike. Naturally, mortals chose the olive. Poseidon sulked, storms raged, and Athens wore her name like a crown. But crowns are heavy things. Ask anyone who has tried on a graduation cap in the wind. And Athens discovered soon enough that the goddess who protected them was not soft, not forgiving. Athena expected her city to embody her, clever, disciplined, merciless to fools. And when mortals strayed too close to pride, she showed a side of herself the poets preferred to gloss over. Take Medusa, for instance. Her story has been bent and reshaped across centuries, but its bones remain the same, a woman punished for a crime she did not commit. In one version, Medusa was a priestess in Athena's temple, sworn to chastity. Poseidon, brash and relentless, pursued her. The sanctuary walls should have protected her. They did not. And when the violation was done, Athena appeared, not to punish Poseidon, the aggressor, but Medusa, the victim. The goddess transformed her into a monster with snakes for hair, a gaze that turned men to stone, a punishment disguised as justice. Mortals whispered about this tale in the corners of the city. They bowed to Athena's statue, yes, but their eyes darted nervously as they prayed. If a goddess could condemn one of her own priestesses to eternal exile, what mercy could they expect? The temple floors glistened with offerings of olive oil, honey, woven cloth. Not gifts of adoration, gifts of appeasement. It is difficult not to think of it in modern terms. Imagine a workplace where the boss punishes the intern for mistakes made by the CEO. Unfair, absurd, and yet somehow terrifyingly familiar. That was Athena, wise enough to see everything, but cold enough to ignore context if pride or order demanded it. And Medusa was not the only one. Arachne, the weaver, lived in Lydia, far from the grandeur of Athens, but close enough to feel the goddess's reach. Arachne's tapestries shimmered with skill, threads so fine they could shame the gods themselves. She wove stories of Olympus, not flattering ones, but raw, exposing their cruelty, their arrogance, their betrayals. Mortals gathered to marvel, whispering that perhaps she outshone Athena herself. It was hubris, yes, but also truth. Athena descended, disguised as an old woman warning Arachne to humble herself. The girl refused. A contest followed. When the looms fell silent, Arachne's tapestry gleamed with perfection, more flawless, more daring than the goddess's own. And Athena, furious, struck her down. Depending on the telling, Arachne hanged herself in despair, or Athena cursed her to crawl forever as a spider, weaving in silence. Either way, the lesson was carved into Greek memory. Never outshine the goddess of wisdom. And yet, you can't help but sympathize with Arachne. Who among us hasn't been told to stay humble, usually by someone who feels threatened? Who hasn't seen talent punished, brilliance dimmed to protect fragile authority? Athena, goddess of reason, proved herself just as petty as the rest. She didn't want truth woven into cloth. She wanted reverence stitched into every thread. Standing in her temple, the marble cold beneath your feet, you might think of these stories. The flickering lamps illuminate her statue tall, armored, spear in hand, eyes that never soften. She isn't smiling. Athena rarely smiled in the myths. She was born from Zeus's head fully grown, already armed, a war cry on her lips. There was no childhood, no softness, no learning curve. Wisdom came to her as sharp as steel, and she wielded it like a weapon. Mortals mistook her for a protector. But wisdom, untempered by compassion, is a blade without a hilt. Athens thrived under her name, yes. Its philosophers, playwrights, warriors, all claimed her patronage. But for every triumph carved in stone, there were whispers of those she crushed. Mortals who dared to speak too boldly, invent too daringly, or question too loudly often found their brilliance shadowed by her disapproval. She demanded excellence, but only on her terms. It is almost funny, in a grim way. People today brag about being perfectionists, as if it were a virtue. But living under Athena was like living with perfectionism personified. Step out of line, make a mistake, or shine too brightly, and she reminded you perfection was hers alone. And so the people prayed. They polished her statues until they gleamed, offered her olives until the amphorae overflowed, sang hymns in her name until their voices cracked. Not out of pure love, but because survival demanded it. To live under Athena's gaze was to walk a tightrope, balancing pride and humility, brilliance and obedience. And if you think that balance sounds exhausting, just wait until you meet Demeter. For Athena might strike down your pride, but Demeter could starve you, your children, and your city with a single turn of her heart. Athena's shadows stretched far beyond marble temples and city gates. She was not the goddess who hovered quietly in myths, appearing only to bless or scold. She was everywhere, threaded into war councils, whispered in the corners of philosophy schools, stamped on silver coins that clinked in the Athenian agora. The owl, her symbol, watched from those coins with wide, unblinking eyes, as though reminding every merchant, every housewife, every slave the goddess is watching. Always. Even her birth carried a note of unease. When Zeus swallowed Metis, the goddess of cunning, he thought he was avoiding a prophecy, that his children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his father, Kronos. But swallowing wisdom only planted it deeper. From Zeus's skull Athena erupted, fully armed, with a battle cry that shook Olympus. She skipped the childhood of scraped knees and bedtime stories. Her first act in existence was to terrify the world. Imagine meeting someone who introduces themselves by kicking down your door and screaming in your face. Hard to recover from that first impression. Her ferocity was not just for enemies. Even those who loved her felt the sting of her temper. Take Pallas, her closest companion in youth. The two sparred often, their mock battles a mix of skill and affection. One day the contest turned deadly. Some say Zeus intervened with his aegis, startling Pallas, and Athena's spear struck true. Pallas fell, lifeless. The goddess, horrified at what she had done, built a statue in her friend's likeness, the Palladium, and carried guilt like a hidden scar. But guilt never softened her. It only hardened into vigilance. The statue itself became a token of divine power. Whoever possessed it was promised protection. Mortals would fight wars over a monument, born of accidental slaughter. That accident revealed something chilling about Athena. She was not immune to error, but she never allowed herself to be weakened by it. Where mortals might grieve and withdraw, Athena transformed mistakes into symbols, narratives, lessons carved in stone. If she hurt you, your suffering became a story of her greatness. And then there was Tiresias. The blind prophet is remembered for his wisdom, but few pause on how he lost his sight. Depending on the version, Tiresias stumbled upon Athena bathing, or perhaps was simply unlucky enough to glimpse her naked. Gods were jealous of their privacy. Athena, furious, struck him blind on the spot. To soften the blow, she offered him the gift of prophecy, an eternal career in knowing truths no one wanted to hear. A harsh trade. Imagine walking into the wrong restroom and being punished by losing your vision, then told, "Cheer up, at least you can see the future." Not exactly comforting. Through stories like these, Athena emerges less as a goddess of wisdom than as a guardian of boundaries. She built fences around herself, her pride, her city, and punished anyone who crossed them, whether deliberately or by accident. Wisdom, in her hands, was not gentle. It was a gatekeeper's tool, a way to decide who could speak, who could shine, who could live unbroken. Even in the grand theatre of war, her sharpness cut. During the Trojan War, Athena's fingerprints marked every twist of fate. She guided heroes, yes. Odysseus, clever and wily, wore her favor like a cloak, but she also stoked bloodshed, egged on conflicts, twisted outcomes to suit her pride. The judgment of Paris, that fateful beauty contest, had enraged her when she was passed over in favor of Aphrodite. The insult festered. And though mortals fought on the beaches of Troy, Athena's grudge hummed in the background like a wasp's sting. On the battlefield, she appeared to mortals as a warrior among warriors, urging them to slaughter with cool precision. She drove Diomedes to wound Ares himself. She steadied Achilles' hand when rage threatened to consume him. She did not weep over the piles of corpses. To her, war was strategy, a board game played with human lives as pieces. Her wisdom shone brightest not in healing wounds, but in calculating where to cut deeper. And when Troy burned, her vengeance reached further still. The Greeks, drunk on victory, defiled her temples. Cassandra, cursed prophetess, sought sanctuary at her altar, only to be dragged away and violated. Athena saw, remembered, and waited. Later, she turned her wrath not on the Trojans. They were already ash, but on the very Greeks she had aided. Storms shattered their fleets on their voyage home. Soldiers drowned, kings fell. Her city Athens would rise, but her allies paid dearly for forgetting that her protection had limits. That was Athena's pattern, loyal until you crossed her, protective until you misstepped, admired until you dared to rival her. And then the mask of wisdom slipped, and you saw the steel beneath. Athenians knew this. They spoke of her brilliance in public, but in private, they measured their words carefully. They prayed not for kindness, but for restraint. For a goddess so precise could easily direct her precision against you. Better to praise her olive tree and hope she did not notice your flaws. It is strange to imagine, isn't it? A city naming itself after a deity not for love, but for fear disguised as reverence. But history is full of leaders we pretend to adore, because the alternative is ruin. Athens did not just inherit Athena's name, it inherited her temperament, ambitious, calculating, proud. The city's philosophers crafted wisdom. Its generals waged war with strategy. Its artists dared brilliance but couched it in piety. Athens became a mirror of its goddess, radiant, but sharp enough to cut you if you stared too long. And yet, mortals never stopped telling her stories. Perhaps because Athena, for all her severity, was familiar. Who hasn't met someone brilliant, inspiring, but terrifying to disappoint? Someone who holds you to impossible standards, then leaves you guessing whether you've pleased them. Athena was that, magnified to divine scale. She was wisdom personified, but wisdom without warmth, knowledge without empathy, and that, mortals discovered, can be as dangerous as ignorance. So the owl watched. Coins clinked. Olive oil smoked in lamps. And the people carried on, knowing the goddess walked beside them in every victory, and loomed over them in every mistake. But if you think Athena's cold precision was unsettling, wait until you stand in the fields of Eleusis. For Demeter's grief was not sharp like a blade, it was heavy as the earth itself. And when she mourned, the soil turned barren, the rivers thinned, and mortals starved in silence beneath the gaze of a mother's rage. The fields of Eleusis lay quiet beneath a pale sun, stalks of barley standing stiff as though waiting for judgment. Demeter's presence lingered there, unseen yet palpable, like the hush before a storm. She was not the Olympian who burst into battle cries or thunderbolts. Her power crept in slowly, hidden in seeds and soil, in the rhythm of growth and hunger. And that, perhaps, made her darkness more terrifying. A sword can cut one man. A famine can cut millions. It began, as so many tragedies did, with a family quarrel disguised as divine politics. Persephone, Demeter's only daughter, wandered through a meadow, gathering flowers, laughing with companions. The air shimmered with innocence, until the earth yawned open, and Hades rose in his black chariot. He seized her in silence, the ground swallowing them both before her screams faded. When Demeter heard, the world tilted. This was no ordinary loss. She was a goddess, accustomed to reverence, to control, to cycles bending at her will. Yet here, her daughter had vanished into the underworld without warning. Imagine misplacing your child at the grocery store. Only instead of an announcement over the loudspeaker, the manager tells you, "Oh, by the way, your brother kidnapped her into eternal darkness." Not exactly reassuring. Demeter's grief transformed into wrath. She tore across the earth searching, disguised as a mortal woman, torch in hand. Fields withered in her wake, streams thinned to trickles. Farmers scratched at cracked soil, praying for rain that never came. She visited temples, shrines, cities. None could soothe her. Even Olympus felt her absence. Mortals, starving, offered fewer sacrifices. Smoke no longer curled from altars. The gods, deprived of worship, grew restless. For once, Zeus noticed. Not out of compassion. Empathy was not his strongest muscle, but out of necessity. Mortals could not honor him if they were too busy dying. He summoned Hermes to broker a deal. Persephone would return, but only if she had not eaten the food of the dead. Of course, Persephone had tasted a handful of pomegranate seeds, crimson as spilled blood. Half the year she would remain with Hades, half with her mother. Thus the seasons were born: spring and summer, when Demeter rejoiced in reunion, autumn and winter when she mourned anew. Mortals learned to live inside her grief, to plant when she smiled, and to huddle when she wept. Her sorrow became their calendar. But beneath this tidy myth lay something harsher. Demeter had turned personal tragedy into a universal condition. Instead of suffering alone, she spread her mourning across the earth. It was as if she decided, if I cannot be happy, no one eats. Childlike, perhaps. Effective. Absolutely. Few dictators in history have wielded hunger so well. Her bitterness lingered in small stories too. Take the tale of Ascalibus. When Demeter, disguised as an old woman, sought hospitality, a kind girl named Misme offered her barley water. Demeter drank it down in great gulps. Ascalibus, a cheeky boy, mocked her thirst, laughing at the way she drained the cup. A mistake. She flung the contents upon him, and instantly he transformed into a lizard, condemned to scuttle in shadows forever. All because he made fun of her chugging speed. Today we'd call that an overreaction. Imagine turning your kid's friend into a reptile for pointing out you drink juice boxes too fast. Then there was the royal house of Eleusis, where she found shelter while disguised as a nurse. She grew fond of the infant Demophon, and, out of gratitude, attempted to grant him immortality. Each night, she placed the baby in fire, burning away his mortal parts, while secretly feeding him ambrosia. One evening, his mother Metanera walked in, screamed, and snatched him away. The ritual was broken. Furious, Demeter revealed her true form in a blaze of divine light, and declared the child doomed to remain mortal. It was the divine equivalent of, "I was trying to do you a favor, and now you've ruined it. Enjoy your regular human death." Gratitude was not her strong suit. Yet it was here, at Eleusis, that Demeter birthed something enduring: the mysteries. Rituals shrouded in secrecy, whispered in caves, enacted with torches and sacred drinks. To be initiated was to taste a fragment of her sorrow and her hope, the cycle of death and rebirth, the promise that life continued even in darkness. Mortals flocked to join, from peasants to emperors. Some claimed the mysteries freed them from the fear of death itself. A curious irony, considering they were founded on a mother's unending grief. Her rites were not for the faint-hearted. Pilgrims fasted, marched miles in solemn processions, drank kykeon, a barley and mint brew said to blur the line between vision and hallucination. They chanted, carried sacred objects in baskets, and finally entered the telesterion, a great hall where the innermost secret was revealed. What happened inside remained locked in silence. Initiates swore never to speak of it. Death itself seemed less terrifying than breaking that vow. And so the mysteries endured, generation after generation, their allure outlasting even the temples of Olympus. But behind the promise of renewal lay Demeter's steel. She had invented a system where survival depended on reverence. If you doubted her, your fields starved. If you mocked her, you crawled as a lizard. If you interrupted her rituals, your name was cursed. She made worship not an act of devotion but of survival. Faith became agriculture, and agriculture became fear. What makes her darkness unsettling is its subtlety. Athena's fury was immediate. Medusa turned to stone in a heartbeat. Hera's vengeance thundered in myths of jealous wrath. But Demeter's punishment crept like winter slow, inevitable, inescapable. A single mother's grief reshaped the climate. Imagine losing your wee fi for half the year, not because of a storm, but because your neighbor was sad. That's the scale of absurdity mortals lived with. Except instead of TikTok videos buffering, it was their actual food supply vanishing. And yet, mortals loved her. They called her Dio, Mother Earth, nourisher of fields. They built temples where farmers wept and begged for rain. They brought the first fruits of harvest to her altars. Because what choice did they have? To neglect Demeter was to invite hunger. She was the mother you could not disappoint, or else dinner never arrived on the table. Every loaf of bread was stamped with her presence. Every sip of beer carried her breath. Gratitude and fear blended until they were indistinguishable. Demeter, for her part, was never softened. Even in her joy. When Persephone returned each spring, her smile was edged with the knowledge that it would not last. She taught mortals that happiness was always temporary. That loss was stitched into the pattern of life. Perhaps that was her greatest cruelty, not the famine, but the reminder that no feast could ever be permanent. Her myths echo with mothers who know what it means to lose. They also echo with power, because Demeter never truly got Persephone back. Half a daughter, half a year. And she turned that half into dominion over the earth's very seasons. Mortals starved and prayed, kings trembled, gods negotiated treaties, because a grieving mother would not be ignored. So the barley swayed again, watered by her return, golden heads nodding in fragile relief. Children ran through fields, chasing each other with shrieks of joy, while their parents sowed seeds with wary hands. They knew the wheel would turn again. They knew the goddess would grieve again. And they knew, with a shiver, that all it took to anger her was a careless word, a mocking laugh, or a forgotten sacrifice. If Athena's shadow fell in sharp lines, Demeter's stretched like dusk, slow, soft, but swallowing everything. And if you think the hunger of mortals was terrible, wait until you step closer to the sea, where Aphrodite rose from foam. For her smile promised love, but her wrath birthed ruin, and few who gazed upon her beauty ever walked away untouched. The sea foamed under a restless sky, churning as though stirred by an unseen hand. From its froth rose a figure, naked, luminous, and terrifyingly serene. Aphrodite stepped onto the shore, her hair glistening like molten gold, her eyes reflecting the infinite blue. Mortals would later say she was born from love itself, but the truth was sharper. She was born from violence, from the severed flesh of Uranus cast into the waves. Beauty and blood mingled at the world's edge. It was an origin story no poet could ignore, because what is love, if not always entwined with ruin? From the moment she emerged, the air bent around her. Flowers bloomed in her footsteps. Birds sang with frantic joy. The gods themselves felt their hearts twist when she entered a room. No one was safe, not even the immortals who thought themselves beyond desire. Aphrodite was not simply beautiful. She was beauty personified, irresistible and merciless. And like any force of nature, she could not be controlled. Zeus, wary of the chaos she might cause, hastily married her off to Hephaestus, the lame god of the forge. It was meant to tether her, to dull her fire with iron. But Aphrodite was not a woman to be caged. While Hephaestus hammered bronze deep in his volcanic workshop, she sought passion elsewhere, choosing lovers with reckless abandon. Most famous among them was Ares, the god of war, a union of lust and bloodshed, of kisses sharp as blades. Together they embodied a truth mortals knew too well: love and war were never far apart. Their affair, of course, did not stay secret. Helios, the sun, saw everything and tattled to Hephaestus. The smith, humiliated, forged an unbreakable net of bronze so fine it was invisible, and he laid it upon their bed. When Aphrodite and Ares tangled themselves in passion, the net snapped shut, trapping them mid-embrace. Hephaestus called the gods to witness their shame, dragging them into the light like insects in amber. But here is the twist: rather than shaming Aphrodite, the spectacle only deepened her allure. The gods laughed, jeered, and whispered. The story spread across Olympus like wildfire. What Hephaestus thought would humiliate her instead immortalized her, as the goddess too desirable to resist. Even war itself could not refuse her. A humiliation turned into legend, and Aphrodite stepped from the net with her power undimmed. She knew the secret. Shame could not cling to one who embraced desire without apology. Her lovers were many and varied. Ours was her match in fury. Anchises, a mortal shepherd, fathered her son Aeneas, destined to wander and found a lineage that would give rise to Rome. Adonis, the beautiful youth, captured her heart so fully that when he was gored by a boar, her grief stained the anemone flower red. Each love ended in tragedy or transformation. Yet Aphrodite never ceased. To love was to risk loss, and she risked it again and again, drawing others into her orbit whether they willed it or not. But Aphrodite was more than passion and play. She was dangerous in quieter ways. When Paris of Troy judged her fairest of the goddesses, she promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. That woman was Helen, already wed to Menelaus of Sparta. The promise led to her abduction, to the burning of Troy, to 10 years of war. One choice, one bribe of desire, set the ancient world aflame. Aphrodite did not hurl thunderbolts or summon earthquakes. She toppled empires with longing. Even in smaller myths, her cruelty shimmered. Consider Hippolytus, the mortal youth who scorned her worship, devoting himself instead to Artemis and her vows of chastity. Insulted, Aphrodite plotted his ruin. She caused his stepmother, Phaedra, to fall violently in love with him. When Hippolytus rejected her, Phaedra, humiliated, accused him of assault and took her own life. Theseus, his father, cursed him, and Poseidon sent a sea monster that shattered his chariot, killing him. One man's disdain had cost him everything, all because Aphrodite demanded reverence. Or take Miraha, cursed by the goddess to lust after her own father. Driven by unnatural desire, she tricked him into bed, and when he discovered the truth, she fled, praying for escape. The gods took pity, transforming her into a tree. From her bark later emerged Adonis, Aphrodite's great love. Even in myths of horror, she stitched beauty from agony, as if reminding mortals that love was never pure, never safe. Her power reached beyond individuals. Sailors prayed to her for safe voyages, not because she calmed the seas, but because she calmed the hearts of those who waited at home. Courtesans dedicated temples to her, seeing in her divine sanction for their trade. Wives feared her, rivals invoked her, and poets both adored and cursed her. She blurred the lines between sacred and profane, between the divine altar and the marriage bed. The Romans, inheriting her cult, made her even more formidable. As Venus, she became mother of Aeneas, ancestor of Julius Caesar and Augustus. Her beauty now underpinned not just affairs of the heart, but affairs of state. Every triumphal arch, every coin stamped with her likeness, declared that Rome's empire itself was born from her. What began as foam and blood at sea had become marble and empire on land. Love itself ruled the Mediterranean. And yet, behind the roses and doves, Aphrodite's darkness lingered. To be loved by her was dangerous. To reject her was fatal. To compete with her was suicidal. She punished women who boasted of beauty, cursed men who resisted her charms, and ensnared gods who underestimated her. She was not sweetness. She was compulsion. And that made her terrifying. For mortals, the lesson was cruel, but clear desire is not optional. You can fight hunger, you can ignore storms, but you cannot unsee beauty, cannot unfeel longing. Aphrodite was not a choice. She was inevitability, and to resist her was to invite ruin. Imagine, then, a world where every glance, every gesture, every heartbeat was touched by her. Farmers sowed seeds, but also whispered prayers to conceive children. Soldiers marched to war, carrying charms blessed in her temples. Lovers carved her name into stone, swearing eternal fidelity that she would mock with a smile. Every aspect of mortal life, birth, marriage, betrayal, loss, fell under her shadow. And perhaps that is why her myths endure so vividly. She was not a goddess far removed on Olympus, concerned only with divine politics. She was in the sweat of palms brushing together, in the ache of a heart betrayed, in the madness of jealousy and the bliss of a kiss. She was at once the sweetest moment of life, and the poison that followed. The ancients did not separate love and destruction, because they had Aphrodite as their teacher. She reminded them that beauty is fleeting, that passion can topple walls, that desire is both gift and curse. No one worshipped her safely. Every hymn risked heartbreak, every prayer risked obsession. Yet they prayed all the same, because to live without her was worse than to suffer by her hand. When night fell on the shores where she was born, the sea still whispered with her name. Foam lapped against stone, soft as a lover's sigh, cruel as a dagger's edge. And in the hush between waves, mortals remembered to love was to serve Aphrodite, and to serve her was to gamble everything. But even her power had its rivals. For if Aphrodite ruled hearts, another god ruled shadows, Hades, keeper of the dead. And while she bound mortals with longing, he bound them with silence. Together they formed the two poles of human fear, the terror of never being loved, and the terror of never living again. The earth trembled not with thunder but with silence. Beneath the soil, beneath the roots of ancient trees, beyond the reach of sunlight, there lay a kingdom vast and unseen. It was not a place of golden feasts or airy hymns. It was the realm of Hades, the god whom mortals feared to name aloud. To speak his title was to invite his attention, and no one wanted the gaze of the underworld's master. They called him instead Plauton, the wealthy one, for beneath his domain lay the veins of silver, the seams of gold, the dark fertility of soil that promised grain. Wealth, both material and eternal, was his to command, yet his wealth came from death, and so he ruled with gravity unmatched by any Olympian. Hades was not cruel, nor was he merciful. He was inevitable. He did not chase mortals as Apollo chased Daphne, nor torment them as Hera tormented rivals. He did not hurl bolts like Zeus or stir waves like Poseidon. He simply waited, patient as stone. Every mortal path, no matter how winding, led eventually to his gate. His realm was mapped in stories more often than in prayers. The entrance lay where earth gaped open caverns, fissures, deep rivers where mist clung. There, souls drifted down, guided by Hermes in his guise as Psychopomp, until they reached the edge of the Styx. Its black waters gleamed with a promise no oathbreaker could escape. For even gods swore by that river, knowing perjury would cost them a decade of silence. At the ferry waited Charon, grim-faced, hand outstretched for payment. Mortals buried their dead with coins beneath the tongue or across the eyes, lest they be stranded, forced to wander the banks in eternal hunger. One coin bought passage, but what came after depended not on wealth but on fate. Across the river, the great gates loomed, guarded by Cerberus the three-headed hound. Each head snarled, drooling foam, eyes burning with an unnatural glow. Yet he wagged his tail for the souls of the dead, letting them enter freely. It was leaving he forbade, for the dead belonged to Hades once they crossed. Beyond lay the kingdom itself, sprawling like a shadow version of the world above. Asphodel fields stretched endlessly, grey and pale, where the majority of souls wandered without joy or sorrow, existing in a haze of memory. There was Elysium too, a brighter meadow, reserved for the few heroes, poets, and chosen who earned bliss. And in the deepest caverns was Tartarus, a pit not of fire but of punishment, where titans groaned in chains and sinners endured torments crafted to fit their crimes. Tantalus, forever thirsty beside water he could never drink. Sisyphus, forever shoving his boulder uphill only for it to roll back down. These were the lessons carved into eternity, reminders that hubris had its price. At the center stood Hades' palace, dark but not ugly, constructed of obsidian and gold, with walls that shimmered faintly like a reflection glimpsed in water. Here the god sat enthroned, his crown wrought of iron, his presence more chilling than fire, more immovable than mountain. Persephone, his queen, often sat beside him, her face a mirror of duality, half the freshness of spring, half the stillness of winter. Their marriage was the most famous tale of Hades, and it carried the essence of who he was. He had seen her in the meadows, laughing among flowers, the daughter of Demeter, goddess of grain. Her beauty was tender, alive, fragrant with life itself. Desire stirred in Hades, but unlike his brothers, he did not seduce or bargain. He took. Cracking the earth open, he rose in his chariot and seized her, dragging her into his world below. The ground sealed behind them, and the meadow was empty. Demeter searched, and in her grief, she withered the earth. Fields lay barren, trees bore no fruit, mortals starved. Finally Zeus was forced to intervene, sending Hermes to negotiate. Persephone could return, unless she had eaten food in the underworld. But she had tasted 6 seeds of a pomegranate, red as spilled blood. Bound by this act, she was tied forever to Hades. A compromise was struck: part of the year she would dwell above with her mother, bringing spring and summer. The rest she would descend to Hades, her husband, and the earth would mourn in autumn and winter. This myth defined Hades in the mortal imagination, not a figure of passion but of inevitability. He did not woo, he claimed. Yet his claim was not wholly monstrous. Unlike Zeus, he did not roam in constant lust. Persephone was his only queen, his sole partner. In art, he is often depicted not as raging, but as solemn beside her, a ruler with dignity. Their union was not gentle, but it was enduring. Hades' other myths are quieter. but they reveal his character. He lent his helmet of invisibility to Perseus to slay Medusa, to Hermes in stealthy missions, to Athena in battle. He did not meddle in mortal wars or romances. His concern was the balance of life and death. When Heracles came to fetch Cerberus as his final labor, Hades allowed it. But only if no weapons were used. Heracles wrestled the beast into submission, and Hades honored his word. Justice, not vengeance, guided him. Yet mortals feared him more than any god. For what they feared was not cruelty, but certainty. Zeus might be bribed, Poseidon might be appeased, Hera might be flattered. But Hades was unyielding. No sacrifice, no hymn, no temple could avert his hand. Temples to him were few, prayers to him whispered in secret. Unlike other gods, he had no need for worship to affirm his power. Every death was his offering. And yet, the ancients did not see him only as terror. To call him Plauton, the giver of wealth, was to acknowledge that death nourished life. Crops sprouted because bodies decayed into soil. Riches were mined from the underworld, wrested from his veins. Even the cycle of seasons turned on his marriage to Persephone. He was feared, yes, but he was necessary. Without him, there would be no endings, and without endings, there could be no beginnings. Hades' role in the great epics reflects this balance. In the Iliad, Achilles sees his shade, bound fate and knows no god can save him. In the Odyssey, Odysseus travels down to the underworld to speak to Tiresias, guided by rituals and sacrifices that allow the dead to rise. The journey itself, known as a catabasis, became a symbol in Greek thought. Descent into Hades was descent into truth. Heroes from Orpheus to Theseus sought it, and not all returned. Orpheus especially embodied the tragedy of Hades' realm. When Eurydice, his beloved, died, Orpheus descended with only his lyre and song. He played before Hades and Persephone, and the king of the dead was moved. Rarely had music softened him so. Hades agreed to release Eurydice, but with one condition. Orpheus must not look back until they both had reached the surface. Step by step, he led her upward, hope burning with every footfall. But at the very edge of daylight, doubt consumed him. He turned too soon. Eurydice vanished back into shadow, this time forever. Hades had kept his word. It was Orpheus who faltered. Such stories underscored Hades' nature. He was not a trickster, not a liar. He was exact, unwavering. His bargains were binding, his promises precise. Mortals failed, but Hades remained constant. In this way, he was perhaps the most honest of the gods. And so his image endured as paradox. Terrifying, but strangely just. His silence was not emptiness, but balance. He was not death itself. That was Thanatos, the winged spirit who cut mortal threads. But the one who kept the realm beyond, the warden of what all must face. He had no temples filled with dancing. He had no myths of adultery, no jealous rampages. He simply ruled, a god of iron and shadow unshaken by the chaos of Olympus. For the Greeks, he was the truth they could not avoid. Beauty fades, youth withers, empires fall, but the underworld remains. Hades waits not in anger, but in certainty. And when mortals lowered their dead into graves, when coins were pressed into cold mouths, when names were whispered into soil, it was not fear alone that filled them. It was recognition. For in Hades' realm, every life found its final equality. Kings and beggars, heroes and cowards, all walked the same asphodel fields. Perhaps that was his quiet lesson. Above, the gods quarreled, seduced, raged, and schemed. But below, Hades reigned with solemn order. Death was not the end of meaning, but its reckoning. And in that reckoning, Hades was absolute. War came not with reason, but with a scream. It rose in the throats of men before their blades even met. A primal surge that drowned thought in the rhythm of pounding hearts. In that scream lived Ares, god of war, of slaughter, of chaos. Unlike Athena, who embodied strategy, discipline, and the calculated order of battle, Ares was the fury of combat itself, the raw storm of violence that knew no master. Where he strode, men lost themselves to rage, and fields drank deep of blood. Among the Olympians, he was both indispensable and despised. Zeus himself admitted his loathing for this son, though he was sired from his own union with Hera. In the Iliad, the king of the gods calls Ares the most hateful of all, for he delights only in strife. Yet Zeus could not cast him aside, for all gods might sneer at him. None could deny that war was woven into the fabric of mortal life. Cities clashed, dynasties fell, nations rose through conquest. And where these things occurred, Ares was present. Unlike the other gods, Ares had little subtlety. He was not a schemer like Hera, not a trickster like Hermes, not a lover of poetry like Apollo. He was battle in its most unrefined form, bloodied, deafening, indiscriminate. He carried his spear, his shield, and wore armor that gleamed red with the reflection of carnage. His companions reflected his nature: Phobos, fear incarnate, and Deimos, terror itself, who rushed beside him in chariots. His sister Eris, goddess of discord, sowed quarrels that led to war, and where her seeds took root, ours reaped the harvest. In art, he appears as a towering warrior, youthful and strong, but often without the dignity of Athena's bearing. He was the crash of bronze, the clatter of hooves, the cries of the dying. He was not honored in the same way as other gods. His shrines were fewer, his cults rarer. Mortals sought his favor only reluctantly, for invoking him meant invoking battle itself, and battle spared no one. His worshippers were often soldiers or cities steeped in martial culture, such as Sparta, where war was not a tragedy but a way of life. In Sparta, Ares was not merely feared but revered. They offered him dogs, fierce and loyal, as sacrifices, and raised altars stained red with blood. To them, Ares was not an intruder but a companion, the god who sharpened the will to fight, who rewarded courage and ferocity. Unlike Athens, which cherished Athena for her wisdom, Sparta saw no shame in Ares' wildness. For them, war was the forge of strength, and Ares was its divine patron. But elsewhere, his myths often humiliated him. The Greeks distrusted war without reason, and so their poets showed Ares as a figure of folly, defeated even by mortals when his fury blinded him. In the Iliad, he fights on the battlefield and is wounded not once, but repeatedly. By Athena's cunning, by Diomedes' spear. He roars like 10,000 warriors struck at once, and flees to Olympus to complain to Zeus, a wounded child rather than an indomitable god. These tales reflect the Greek unease with his presence. They could not deny war's necessity, yet they scorned its excess. Ours embodied the side of conflict. They wished to restrain the madness that consumes reason, the bloodshed that knows no justice. In their mythology, Athena often triumphs over him, for strategy must prevail over fury, order over chaos. Yet Ares' role was more complex than simple disdain. For in his love affair with Aphrodite, goddess of beauty and desire, he revealed another dimension. The two were opposites, she, the enchantress, he, the destroyer. And yet they belonged together, passion and violence intertwined. Theirs was no lawful union. Aphrodite was wed to Hephaestus, the smith. But she sought Ares in secret, their embraces heated with the fire of both lust and battle. When Hephaestus discovered their affair, he crafted a net finer than any woven thread, unbreakable yet invisible, and caught them in the act. The other gods laughed as they were displayed in shame. Yet even this humiliation could not sever their bond. For beauty and war are eternally linked. Desire sparks jealousy, jealousy breeds conflict, and conflict demands blood. Ars and Aphrodite are not merely lovers, they are cosmic partners. From their union sprang children emblematic of their nature: Eros, the force of desire; Harmonia, the embodiment of concord born from strife; and the twin terrors, Phobos and Deimos. This paradox defined Ares. He was at once loathed and essential, mocked and feared. He was the god mortals prayed would stay far away, yet also the one they invoked when they sharpened blades. For when war comes, it cannot be denied, and in that moment, Ares is sovereign. His presence stretched beyond Greece as well. The Romans identified him with Mars, and here his nature shifted. Mars was not merely destruction, but also protector, father of Romulus and Remus, forefather of Rome itself. Where Ares was despised, Mars was exalted. He embodied not only war's bloodshed, but also its discipline, and its role in founding order. For Rome, war was not chaos but destiny, and Mars was its divine engine. Yet beneath this Roman sheen, the raw heart of Ares still beat. The frenzy of battle, the uncontrollable hunger for conquest. These were his gifts. Even when cloaked in civic pride, mortals feared him for good reason. To encounter Ares in battle was to lose one's mind to frenzy. Men forgot fathers, brothers, lovers. They struck blindly, consumed by rage, unable to see friend from foe. He was the madness in the clash, the trembling in the heart, the red haze that turned fields into slaughterhouses. Yet even here lies truth, for war is not only about strategy or politics. War is also about fury, about the unleashing of something ancient within humanity that cannot be reasoned with. Ours was that force personified. And so he remained, a god both mocked and indispensable. Without him, no epic could be sung, for heroes prove themselves in war. Achilles' wrath, Hector's stand, Odysseus' trials, all bore Ares' shadow. Without him there would be no glory, for glory is measured in battle. Yet with him came horror, for every victory carved itself upon corpses. The Greeks lived in this tension, despising Ares yet unable to deny his dominion. Perhaps that is why his myths often show him wounded, driven off, humiliated. It was their way of taming him, of reminding themselves that war's fury must be checked, that Athena's wisdom must always triumph. But in their hearts, they knew that Ares would never be silenced. He would return, in the clash of shields, in the cry of men charging to death. For Ares is not a god to be outwitted forever. He is the scream that waits within every soldier, the fire that waits in every city's ambition. And when mortals buried their dead from war, when pyres burned and mothers wept, they cursed Ares' name. Yet when armies gathered again, when kings raised banners and sent their sons to march, they called to him, prayed for his strength, begged his presence. For even hated, he was needed. He was the eternal contradiction the god despised, the god summoned. As sat upon his chariot of bronze, Phobos and Deimos beside him, his eyes blazing not with thought but with hunger. He was not subtle, not clever, not kind. He was the cry of the battlefield, the clamour of steel, the inevitability of death in combat. And though mortals might mock him in tales, though Zeus himself scorned him, every time blood was spilled in war, every time men raised arms against one another, Ares reigned. For war in all its madness is as eternal as death. Love does not announce itself with a clash of arms or a crack of thunder. It arrives in silence, soft as a glance, sudden as a heartbeat skipped, irresistible as a tide. In Greek myth, no figure embodied that mystery more completely than Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and desire. Where Ares was fury, she was enchantment. Where Athena stood for reason, she was passion unbound. And though poets praised and cursed her in equal measure, none could deny her dominion. For love, whether tender or destructive, was as inevitable as death itself. Her birth was unlike any other. The most famous tale, told by Hesiod, places her beginning not in a womb but in the sea. When Cronus struck down his father Uranus, casting the severed genitals into the waves, the ocean foamed white, and from that foam rose Aphrodite. She drifted ashore on the island of Cyprus, luminous and radiant, the sea's spray clinging to her skin like pearls. From this, she was named Aphrodite. She was born of foam. In that moment, the world had gained a power that no sword nor chain could resist, the force of desire itself. Yet another version speaks differently, that she was born of Zeus and the Titaness Dione, sprung not from violence but from lineage. The Greeks themselves seemed uncertain which story to favour, and perhaps that was fitting. For love cannot be confined to one origin. It arises from bloodshed as easily as from peace, from violence as much as from harmony. Aphrodite belonged to both tales, for she was at once tender and cruel. Wherever she walked, beauty unfolded. Flowers bloomed beneath her steps. Doves circled her chariot. The air itself seemed to glow with her presence. She was not merely pleasing to look upon. She was irresistible. Gods and mortals alike found themselves undone before her. For her gift was not only outward loveliness, but the divine spark of attraction, the unseen thread that binds one soul to another, the hunger that burns in silence until it cannot be ignored. Yet with beauty came danger. Desire is not gentle, it consumes. Aphrodite's power often brought ruin as much as joy. Those who fell under her spell abandoned reason, betrayed loyalties, and toppled kingdoms. And none illustrate this more clearly than Paris of Troy. When Eris, goddess of discord, cast her golden apple among the goddesses, inscribed with the words, "To the fairest," three claimed it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Zeus, unwilling to choose, appointed Paris, prince of Troy, as judge. Each goddess offered him a gift. Hera promised power. Athena promised wisdom and victory, but Aphrodite promised the most beautiful woman in the world as his bride. Paris, enthralled, chose her, and thus Helen, already wed to Menelaus of Sparta, was taken to Troy, and the Trojan War began. In this, Aphrodite was not merely a bystander but a catalyst. Her promise set aflame a conflict that consumed heroes and kingdoms alike. It was not the only time her hand was seen in mortal affairs. Again and again, she wove love into the fabric of myths, binding couples, sparking rivalries, toppling empires. She aided those who served her, punished those who defied her. When Hippolytus scorned her worship, preferring the virgin huntress Artemis, Aphrodite destroyed him by kindling a forbidden passion in his stepmother Phaedra. When Anchises, a mortal shepherd, caught her eye, she descended in disguise, and from their union was born Aeneas, destined to be a hero of Troy and a forefather of Rome. Love, in her hands, was not merely a sweetness, it was destiny itself. Her marriage, however, was one of the strangest in Olympus. Zeus, perhaps fearing her allure might unravel the gods themselves, bound her to Hephaestus, the smith. Hephaestus was steady in genius, but lame of leg and far from the fiery vision of desire. Aphrodite did not love him. Her heart turned instead to Ares, god of war, and together they embodied the twin forces of passion and violence. Their affair was no secret. It blazed across Olympus, until Hephaestus ensnared them in his unbreakable net, catching them in the act and summoning the gods to witness. Laughter rang out at their shame, yet the bond between love and war was not broken. For who can deny that desire and conflict often walk hand in hand? Yet Aphrodite was not only a goddess of passion. She was also a goddess of union, of harmony, of bonds formed through love rather than blood or war. Her daughter Harmonia, born from her union with Ares, embodied this balance, the peace that can arise even out of strife. To mortals, Aphrodite's touch could mean the sweetness of marriage, the joy of children, the tenderness of affection. She presided not only over lust, but over connection, reminding the Greeks that love was a thread as necessary as food or fire. But the Greeks were wary of her, just as they were of Ares, for they knew that love could be cruel. It could lead a man to betray his city, a woman to forsake her family, a king to plunge his realm into war. Poets often showed Aphrodite as capricious, even vindictive. Those who resisted her often suffered. The story of Psyche, though Roman in its fullest telling, captures this spirit immortal woman, so beautiful she rivaled the goddess herself. Envious, Aphrodite demanded her downfall, sending her son Eros to make Psyche fall in love with a monster. Yet the tale turned against her intention, for Eros himself fell for Psyche, and through trials and suffering, the mortal was elevated to divinity. Even the goddess of love could not master the force she embodied. Her Roman form, Venus, reveals another side. To Rome, she was not only a goddess of beauty, but a mother of nations. Through Aeneas, she became the divine ancestress of the Roman people, exalted as Venus Genetrix, Venus the Mother. Unlike the Greeks, who treated Aphrodite with suspicion, the Romans celebrated her as a bringer of destiny. Her temples stood proudly, her festivals thrived, her name was carried on banners of empire. Yet beneath the Roman grandeur still lay the same paradox, love's sweetness and its cruelty, its power to build and to destroy. Her symbols were many, and each told of her essence. The dove, gentle and soft, spoke of peace and devotion. The swan, graceful upon water, suggested beauty and elegance. The rose, blooming in crimson, revealed both passion and fragility, for its thorns cut as deeply as its petals delighted. The myrtle tree, evergreen, spoke of enduring love. And the seashell, curved and gleaming, recalled her birth from the waves. Each was a token of her nature delicate, alluring, yet edged with danger. Mortals prayed to her in whispers, not always with joy but often with desperation. Lovers sought her blessing, barren couples begged her for children. Sailors invoked her to calm the seas that birthed her. But just as many cursed her, blaming her for jealousies, betrayals, and heartbreaks. For Aphrodite was not bound to kindness. She gave freely, but she also punished. She was as unpredictable as the tides, as fickle as the heart. Yet in this lay her truth: love cannot be controlled. It can be nurtured, resisted, or denied, but it always finds a way. It grows where it is forbidden, burns where it is unwanted, thrives where it is cherished. Aphrodite was that inevitability made flesh, the divine spark that no prayer nor curse could fully master. In Homer's Iliad, her presence is subdued, yet telling. When wounded by Diomedes in battle, she flees Olympus in tears, mocked by Athena and Hera. To the warrior poets, she seemed weak, unsuited to the battlefield. Yet this dismissal misses her deeper role. For even as armies clashed, what were they fighting for but love? Love of family, of homeland, of glory. What was Helen but the embodiment of Aphrodite's promise? Though she did not wield a spear, her influence guided every sword. Thus she endured, not as a goddess easily adored or simply reviled, but as one whose power could never be escaped. For even gods bowed to her, Zeus himself, king of the heavens, found his will ensnared by desire. Poseidon, lord of seas, fell prey to longing. None were immune. Even those who mocked her felt her chains. For love is the one force that humbles all, king and beggar, god and mortal alike. And so Aphrodite remained, a goddess radiant and merciless, tender and cruel. She was the warmth of an embrace, the fire of a stolen kiss, the grief of betrayal, the ecstasy of union, the sorrow of parting. She was all these things at once, inseparable, unresolvable. To worship her was to admit that love governs all, whether we welcome it or not. On Cyprus, her temples bloomed with offerings. On the shores where she was said to have risen from foam, pilgrims left garlands, songs, and prayers. In Rome, she became the foremother of empire. And across the centuries her name endured, woven into art, into poetry, into every story of passion that followed. For though the Olympians have faded from worship, Aphrodite never vanished. She is present wherever hearts beat faster, wherever longing burns, wherever beauty compels. Her laughter is the echo in every love song. Her shadow is the ache in every heartbreak. And her power, as old as the sea itself, endures as long as there are mortals to feel. For Aphrodite is not a goddess who belongs to myth alone. She is eternal, as inescapable as the tide that once bore her to shore. The night feels heavy, as though Olympus itself holds its breath. You've wandered long among the goddesses, through love's cruel fires, wisdom's unforgiving cold, vengeance's bitter whispers, and even Persephone's haunted reign in shadow. Yet there is still one more corridor of myth to step into before this long descent finds its end. If you thought you had grown used to cruelty in silk robes and power laced with roses, wait until you hear the silence of the ones they chose to forget. For every goddess who ruled with fury or glittered with beauty, there were those whose myths dissolved into the edges, figures who did not command temples as vast as Athena's or stir wars as violently as Hera. These were the outliers, the goddesses whose stories were quieter yet darker, not because of thunder or flame, but because of what they revealed about how mortals and gods alike could discard what they feared. And among them, none are so unsettling as Hecate. Hecate was never one to take her place neatly within the shining ranks of Olympus. She belonged to the crossroads, literally and figuratively. Imagine a place where three roads meet under the moonlight, the wind carrying the smell of extinguished torches, a dog howling in the distance. That's her realm. Not the bustling agora, not the gilded halls, but the borderlands, the in-between, where the boundaries blur and safety ends. If the other goddesses represented domains mortals might aspire to, wisdom, love, fertility, revenge, Hecate embodied everything mortals feared to face alone in the dark. Her presence in myth is fleeting but powerful, like a shadow caught at the corner of your vision. She was guardian of witches, keeper of the keys to hidden knowledge, the one who walked with torches through the night, when no other light dared burn. Her gifts were strange herbs that healed and poisoned alike, words that twisted the air, rituals whispered at midnight crossroads where offerings of bread, cheese, and blood were left for her unseen dogs. Mortals rarely called her name aloud. To do so was to invite attention, and attention from Hecate was never gentle. And yet she was respected. Even Zeus gave her honors, granting her power over earth, sea, and sky. Perhaps he knew better than to challenge what lurks where the road forks. Mortals understood too. They feared her, but fear has always been a form of worship. And so they whispered, left offerings in the dark, and hoped that by feeding her presence, it might pass them by rather than claim them. This is where the unsettling humor creeps in. Because if you think about it, Hecate was the goddess of what you'd Google at 2 a.m. If ancient Athens had Wi-Fi. Strange shadow outside my house. What does it mean? Or, which herb will curse my annoying neighbor without killing them? She was the one you turned to when the polite prayers to Athena or Demeter didn't cut it. When you needed something raw, something dangerous. Basically, she was the friend with connections. Everyone swore they didn't use but secretly did. Her associations with the dead only deepened her shadowed throne. Ghosts were said to follow her, their cries carried by the wind. Dogs howled at her passing. And if you've ever heard a pack of dogs erupt into a midnight chorus, for no reason, you know exactly why mortals connected that sound to the goddess. To walk at night, to pass a crossroads, to hear barking without seeing a single animal, These were signs she was near, and you didn't cross her path lightly. What makes Hecate's presence darker than the others is the way she straddled two worlds, protector and punisher, giver of magic and taker of safety. She was invoked to ward off evil spirits, but also to summon them. She could protect a household from curses, or deliver the curse herself. She was not a goddess you simply prayed to with honey and roses. She was a deal you struck, hoping you worded it carefully enough not to regret it. Mortals, of course, were terrible negotiators. They thought gifts at a crossroads would guarantee her favor, as though tossing food to the shadows ensured safety. But that's like thinking you can bribe your internet provider with cookies to fix your connection. It might work once, but good luck when the system crashes again. Hecate wasn't swayed by cheap offerings. What she wanted was deeper acknowledgement of fear itself, reverence for the unknown, acceptance that mortals were never fully in control of their fates. Stories of witches in later Greek and Roman imagination all found their roots in her. Every whispered spell, every ritual done under the moonlight, every potion mixed from roots pulled at midnight. These were hers. She gave mortals power, but with it, danger. Magic was a gift, but like beauty from Aphrodite, it was one that cut both ways. Mortals might ask for love, revenge, safety, or wealth, but the fine print always followed. You didn't leave Hecate's presence unchanged. And perhaps this is why she unsettles us most of all. Aphrodite's cruelty was wrapped in roses, Hera's vengeance in golden thrones, Athena's punishment in wisdom's cloak. But Hecate, she offered you exactly what you asked for, then let you discover the price. No thunderbolts, no raging speeches, just the eerie silence of consequences playing out on their own. And isn't that the most terrifying kind of justice? As you stand with her in imagination, torches burning low, dogs growling softly at your heels, you realize she is not loud. She does not need to be. Her power is in the pause, the shadow, the question you ask yourself when you're alone in the dark. And when you leave the crossroads, heart pounding, glancing over your shoulder, you'll wonder if you've left her behind, or if she decided to follow. It's strangely comforting, though, to think the ancients dealt with the same fears we do. They too heard strange noises at night, too feared the unknown, too longed for control over the uncontrollable. The difference is they named that fear, gave it a face, a torch, and a throne. They called her Hecate. And here is where the shadow sharpens again. Because if Hecate ruled the crossroads and Persephone the underworld, what happens when the two overlap? What happens when fear of the unknown meets the inevitability of death? The Greeks knew this answer, but they rarely spoke it aloud, because some unions were too unsettling even for myth. So if you've walked this far, don't turn back now. The torchlight flickers, the dogs are restless, and the night is heavy with expectation. Ahead waits the final descent, where the goddesses no longer whisper but demand. And if you thought Hecate was unsettling, wait until you face the ending they saved for last. The torches burn lower now. You have wandered long, step by step, across the shadowed halls of Olympus, through caves of the underworld, and across moonlit crossroads where dogs bay at unseen figures. Each goddess has left her mark. Aphrodite's cruel beauty, Hera's burning jealousy, Athena's sharp, edged wisdom, Demeter's grief, Persephone's shadows, Hecate's torches. They are still here with you, whispering in the dark. And yet, as you stand at the edge of the journey, there remains one question left unspoken. What do these myths mean when the torches go out? The Greeks never told their stories as idle entertainment. Every myth was a mirror, each goddess a reflection of something mortals knew, but could not name outright. To walk through their tales is to confront human desires and fears made larger than life, given crowns and wings, thrones and temples. But beneath the thunder and the marble, beneath the poetry and hymns, there was always a human truth waiting in silence. That truth is what we reach for now, in this closing hour. Consider again Aphrodite, stepping from the foam. She is beauty, yes, but beauty sharpened to a blade. Her dark side teaches that love is not gentle, that desire can consume more than fire, that longing can bend kingdoms to ruin. The Greeks understood that attraction was both the spark of creation and the seed of destruction. And perhaps we recognize it still, that the things we find most beautiful are the things that most easily undo us. Then Hera, queen of Olympus, never content to sit quietly on her throne. Her jealousies and vengeance often made her cruel, but cruelty wrapped around a kernel of pain. For Hera was the goddess of marriage. Yet her own husband betrayed her endlessly. She showed mortals that even queens bled from wounds of betrayal, that even sacred vows could be broken. In her fury, she became monstrous. But in that monstrosity, she was human too. The Greeks gave her temples not because they adored her tenderness, but because they feared her wrath and respected her resilience. Athena stands differently, cloaked not in roses or vengeance, but in reason. Yet even wisdom carried shadows. For her logic was unbending, her justice too sharp for mercy. She reminded mortals that intellect could save them, but also isolate them. Her punishments were not wild storms, but calculated decisions, as merciless as geometry. The Greeks feared this too, that a mind without compassion is as dangerous as passion without thought. Demeter and Persephone stand together, eternally intertwined in the myth of loss. The dark side here is not rage or desire, but absence itself, the grief of a mother, the compromise of a daughter. The recognition that life comes with seasons of death. In Demeter's famine and Persephone's descent, the Greeks found explanation for their hunger, their winters, their endless cycle of sorrow and renewal. It is perhaps the most human myth of all, acknowledging that loss is permanent, yet life still forces itself forward, like green shoots through frozen soil. And then Hecate, keeper of keys, torch bearer at the crossroads. Her presence lingers longest, because she is not bound to a throne in Olympus or even the Underworld. She walks the borderlands, the liminal places, the thresholds where we are most vulnerable. The Greeks saw her in every unexplained noise, every restless night, every fear that came without form. She was the goddess of what cannot be controlled, and therefore, the goddess who felt closest of all, because who has not stood in the dark, heart pounding, whispering to a presence they cannot see. When you gather them all, when you place their shadows side by side, the Greeks were telling a larger story. The goddesses were not soft or simple. They were not tidy ideals. They were contradictions, beauty that destroys, loyalty that imprisons, wisdom that punishes, love that devours, grief that feeds famine, power that corrupts, mystery that unsettles. And through these contradictions, the Greeks acknowledged a truth many of us still resist, that life itself is not gentle. Yet there is a strange comfort in this recognition, because if even the goddesses themselves were trapped in cycles of jealousy, fury, loss, and longing, then mortals were never alone in their suffering. The myths said, "You will desire, and it will hurt. You will love, and it will betray. You will think yourself wise, and it will isolate you. You will grieve, and the world will go on without you. You will fear the dark, and it will never leave." But these are not flaws. These are the conditions of being alive, and even goddesses bear them. Think, too, of how the Greeks engaged with these shadows. They did not bury them. They carved them into stone, painted them on vases, sang them in hymns. They made temples to jealousy, altars to grief, prayers to fear. They turned their darkest truths into sacred stories, then lived with them. This was their brilliance. Not to erase pain, but to give it shape, to honor it, to admit that even the most terrifying forces could be faced if they were named. And here we arrive at the heart of it. The dark side of the Greek goddesses is not really darkness at all, but honesty. The Greeks knew life was not fair, not clean, not merciful. And so they built a pantheon of goddesses who reflected that, who lived out what mortals could not admit openly. The myths were not cautionary tales in the way we often imagine them. They were catharsis. An acknowledgement that the world was cruel, that beauty was sharp, that wisdom was merciless, that grief was endless. To hear these stories was to breathe easier, because if even the divine suffered such contradictions, then how could mortals expect perfection from themselves? This is why, in the quiet of night, the stories endure. They are not simply entertainments of the past. They are reminders that humans have always grappled with the same questions, the same fears, the same longings. And the goddesses, in their contradictions, whisper still, you are not alone. As you step away from the crossroads, away from the underworld, away from Olympus itself, you carry those whispers with you. Perhaps tonight, when you close your eyes, you'll hear the faint rustle of Aphrodite's laughter, or Hera's sharp inhale, or Athena's quiet judgment. Perhaps you'll feel the cold touch of Persephone's winter, the warmth of Demeter's return, or the eerie glow of Hecate's torch. And perhaps you'll realize that these goddesses never truly left, that their shadows walk beside us, just as they always have. The journey ends here, but the myths do not. They live on in every story told, every name spoken, every quiet fear admitted in the dark. And maybe that is the true gift of the Greek goddesses. Not that they ruled Olympus, but that they revealed the truth of being human in a way mortals could bear. So now, as the torches finally gutter out, as the last echoes fade, you may rest. The dark sides of the goddesses have been seen, their shadows walked through. The myths have done their work. Close your eyes, traveler. The goddesses are still here, but they are quieter now. They will watch as you drift, not into Olympus, not into the underworld, but into the gentler realm of dreams.